Trump just refused to stand for the judge. Federal marshals stepped forward in what courtroom observers are calling the most tense 6-minute standoff they've ever witnessed in a federal courthouse. And this isn't some minor protocol dispute or courtroom theatrics. This is a sitting former president openly defying judicial authority in front of a packed federal courtroom, forcing armed federal law enforcement to intervene when basic respect for the court collapsed entirely. When a defendant refuses the most fundamental courtroom protocol and marshals have to step forward with their hands, moving toward restraints, you know something extraordinary has just shattered every expectation of presidential conduct. Hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss any of the videos I release. So, what triggered this unprecedented confrontation between Trump and federal Judge Aileen Cannon? At exactly 2:47 p.m. Eastern on January 14th, during a critical pretrial hearing on classified documents, Judge Cannon issued what legal experts are calling the most direct judicial rebuke of a former president in modern American history. This isn't just another legal hearing or routine court appearance. Members of the press gallery, veteran court reporters, and even Trump's own legal team watched in stunned silence as 6 minutes of defiance unfolded that legal scholars say violated every norm of federal court procedure. And believe me, when federal marshals approach a defendant's table and a former president chooses confrontation over compliance, something seismic has just torn through the foundation of our legal system. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding. Tensions in Judge Cannon's courtroom have been building for weeks, fueled by repeated clashes over classified evidence, discovery disputes, and what prosecutors have described as a pattern of deliberate obstruction. But everything escalated during Tuesday's hearing when newly unsealed FBI memos revealed that Trump personally retained documents marked top secret in his private residence. For 18 months after leaving office, despite repeated federal demands for their return, the memo, declassified just hours before the hearing, contained surveillance footage, timestamps showing Trump personally moving boxes containing classified materials from a secure storage area to his personal office on 3 separate occasions. Between March and August 2022, this wasn't about mishandled paperwork or document organization disputes. It was about a former president deliberately concealing national security materials from federal investigators while claiming full compliance with government demands. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. Here's where it really gets serious. When Judge Cannon reviewed the FBI evidence in her chambers during a brief recess, she emerged with what court observers described as an expression they had never seen from her before. And let's be honest for a moment. Judicial rebukes of this magnitude are extraordinarily rare in federal court. They don't happen over procedural disagreements or legal interpretation disputes. They happen when a judge concludes that a defendant has crossed a line that threatens the integrity of the entire judicial process. Here's what multiple courtroom sources say happened next. At 2:45 p.m., Judge Cannon returned to the bench after a 2-3-minute recess, reviewing the declassified FBI materials. The courtroom included 47 members of the press, 12 members of Trump's legal team, and 8 federal prosecutors. Sources told CNN that when Judge Cannon took her seat, Trump remained seated at the defendant's table, scrolling through what appeared to be social media on his phone. "All rise," the bailiff announced as is standard protocol when a federal judge enters the courtroom. Every person in the courtroom stood immediately. Every person except Donald Trump. "Mr. Trump," Judge Cannon said, her voice cutting through the sudden silence, "please stand for the court." Trump looked up from his phone, made eye contact with the judge, and remained seated. Court observers say he then returned his attention to his device, typing what appeared to be a social media post. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. I read every single one. Now, things get absolutely explosive. Judge Cannon waited exactly 15 seconds, according to the court stenographer's official transcript. The courtroom had fallen into what one veteran reporter described as the kind of silence you feel in your chest. Judge Cannon then repeated her instruction. "Mr. Trump, I am directing you to stand for this court now." Sources inside the courtroom say Trump slowly raised his eyes from his phone, stared directly at Judge Cannon for what felt like an eternity, and spoke the words that would trigger the most unprecedented courtroom confrontation in presidential history. "I don't recognize the authority of this kangaroo court," Trump said, his voice loud enough to be heard in the press gallery, "and I'm not standing for it." That's when federal marshals stepped forward. The sound of their boots on the courtroom floor sent porters scrambling for their phones and Trump's own attorneys leaning forward in visible alarm. This move sent shockwaves through the federal courthouse. When a defendant openly defies basic judicial authority and federal law enforcement has to intervene, it signals that we've crossed into genuinely uncharted constitutional territory. The claims that this is political persecution collapse when a former president chooses to escalate a simple protocol issue into a federal standoff. This isn't the first time a president has clashed with judicial authority. Think back to Richard Nixon during the Saturday Night Massacre when he fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. Federal courts ruled that executive privilege couldn't override judicial subpoenas, and the Supreme Court ultimately forced Nixon to release the Watergate tapes. Nixon complied with the court orders even as his presidency crumbled around him, even when facing certain impeachment. Nixon understood that presidential power had constitutional limits when confronted by judicial authority. Then there was Bill Clinton during the Paula Jones case. Clinton fought the lawsuit all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that a sitting president shouldn't face civil litigation while in office. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously against him in Clinton versus Jones, and Clinton appeared for his deposition. Even though he clearly didn't want to be there, legal historians note that Clinton showed visible frustration during his testimony, but never once challenged the basic protocols of the judicial process itself. But here's what makes Trump's behavior so fundamentally different from every previous presidential confrontation with the courts. Andrew Jackson famously said about a Supreme Court ruling he opposed, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." But Jackson never stood in a federal courtroom and refused to follow basic judicial protocols while facing criminal charges. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War, directly challenging Chief Justice Roger Taney's authority, but Lincoln never appeared in court as a defendant and then refused to show respect for judicial proceedings. Constitutional law professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School told the Washington Post that Trump's courtroom defiance represents a categorical break from 235 years of American constitutional tradition. Tribe explained that while presidents have challenged court rulings, appealed adverse decisions, and even criticized judicial overreach, none have ever refused to follow basic courtroom decorum while appearing as criminal defendants. More importantly, legal scholars are noting that Trump's behavior reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how American constitutional government actually works. The president is not above the law when he's in office, and he's certainly not above the law when he becomes a private citizen facing criminal charges, explained Neil Katyal, former acting Solicitor General under Obama. What we witnessed Tuesday was someone who still believes that political power grants permanent immunity from legal accountability. The comparison becomes even starker when you consider how foreign leaders have handled similar situations. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy stood respectfully for judges during his corruption trial, despite claiming the charges were politically motivated. Former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu followed all court protocols during his bribery hearings, even while attacking the legitimacy of the proceedings outside the courtroom. Former South Korean President Park Geun-hye maintained courtroom decorum throughout her impeachment trial, despite arguing that the entire process was unconstitutional. What makes democracies work is that everyone, including former leaders, accepts that judicial authority applies to them, said Ruth Benget, an expert on authoritarianism at New York University. When former leaders refuse to acknowledge basic judicial authority, they're essentially declaring that democratic institutions don't apply to them. That's how democratic systems begin to collapse. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. Its content doesn't exist anywhere else. And let's not forget Trump's own previous courtroom appearances during his business litigation years. He sat through depositions, stood for judges, and followed basic court protocols. Even when facing hostile questioning about Trump University or his foundation, But now, however, it's different. This time, we're witnessing something that has never happened before in American legal history. The pattern is clear. When presidents face judicial authority, they may fight the rulings. They may appeal the decisions. But they follow basic courtroom protocol until now. So, what allegedly triggered this unprecedented breakdown in courtroom decorum? According to legal experts who reviewed the newly declassified FBI materials, the evidence shows a clear pattern of obstruction that goes far beyond document retention issues. The FBI memo reportedly documents Trump personally instructing staff members to move classified documents to unsecured locations within Mar-a-Lago on at least 6 occasions between February and September 2022. These weren't routine decisions about office organization. Sources familiar with the investigation say the documents included nuclear weapons specifications, foreign intelligence assessments, and detailed military operational plans for ongoing missions in 3 hostile regions. Here's the kicker. Memo reportedly includes audio recordings of Trump telling staff members that certain documents should be kept in his personal safe because they prove I was right about everything, and that investigators can't handle the truth about what really happened. This wasn't a former president accidentally retaining government property. It was a deliberate effort to maintain control over classified national security information for personal purposes. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. And here's what should alarm everyone. This isn't just about one courtroom confrontation or one defendant's defiance. If a former president can openly reject judicial authority in a federal courthouse without facing immediate consequences, the entire foundation of equal justice under law begins to crumble before our eyes. Once that precedent is set, there's no turning back from a system where political status determines whether someone has to follow the law. This puts federal law enforcement in an almost impossible position. On one side, they have clear legal obligations to maintain courtroom order and enforce judicial commands regardless of who is sitting at the defendant's table. That means treating Trump exactly like any other defendant who refuses to stand for a federal judge. On the other side, they're dealing with a former president who still commands fanatical loyalty from millions of Americans who see any enforcement action as proof of a political conspiracy against their leader. The Marshals in Tuesday's courtroom found themselves facing a situation that their training never anticipated. Federal Marshal Service. Protocols are clear about how to handle defendants who refuse judicial commands, progressive escalation from verbal warnings to physical restraint if necessary. But those protocols were written with ordinary defendants in mind, not former presidents with active Secret Service protection details and millions of devoted followers. Sources within the Marshal Service speaking on condition of anonymity told Politico that Tuesday's incident required real-time coordination between multiple federal agencies. Secret Service agents who are responsible for protecting Trump, even during criminal proceedings, had to coordinate with federal marshals about how to handle potential physical intervention. Nobody wanted to be the first federal agent to put hands on a former president, one source explained. But nobody wanted to be responsible for allowing judicial authority to completely collapse either. The legal precedent implications extend far beyond Trump himself. Defense attorneys across the country are already noting that if Trump can refuse basic court protocols without immediate consequences, their clients should receive the same consideration. Public defenders in Chicago, Miami, and Los Angeles have reportedly begun citing the Trump precedent in motions, arguing that their clients shouldn't be required to stand for judges if they find the proceedings politically biased. This creates a massive problem for federal courts nationwide, explained Sarah Christoph, a former federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. Either we enforce courtroom protocols equally regardless of political status, or we create a two-tier justice system where some defendants get special treatment based on their fame or political connections. There's no middle ground here. And here's the tricky part. There's no precedent to follow. Either the justice system treats Trump like any other defendant who defies judicial authority, which could trigger unprecedented political chaos, or it creates a special exception for former presidents, which would fundamentally undermine the principle that no one is above the law. Legal and constitutional experts are calling this a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. Frank Figley, former FBI assistant director, told MSNBC that if the evidence is accurate, Trump's actions represent clear obstruction of justice. That would result in immediate detention for any other defendant. When someone refuses basic courtroom protocols while facing national security charges, that person becomes a flight risk and a threat to ongoing proceedings, Figlisi explained. Barbara McQuaid, former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, added a chilling perspective during her CNN appearance Tuesday night. What we witnessed wasn't just disrespect for one judge, McQuaid emphasized. This was a direct attack on the constitutional principle that judicial authority derives from law, not from the personal preferences of defendants. Decide they can pick and choose which aspects of judicial authority to recognize. We're watching the rule of law collapse in real time. The implications become even more serious when you consider the classified documents at the center of this case. Former CIA Director John Brennan told NBC News that Trump's courtroom behavior suggests someone who fundamentally doesn't understand that his access to classified information was a privilege, not a right. Brennan explained that the same mindset that leads someone to retain top-secret documents without authorization is the same mindset that leads them to believe judicial authority doesn't apply to them. Career federal prosecutors are expressing unprecedented concern about what Tuesday's events mean for ongoing cases. I've prosecuted everyone from organized crime bosses to corrupt politicians, said Glenn Kirshner, a former federal prosecutor with 30 years of experience. I've never seen a defendant openly defy a federal judge and remain free. The fact that we're even debating whether to enforce basic courtroom protocols shows how far our justice system has been compromised by political considerations. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. Even Jonathan Turley, a George Washington University law professor who frequently defends Trump's legal positions, acknowledged that the courtroom defiance was deeply problematic and potentially criminal. He emphasized that while defendants have rights, those rights don't include openly defying judicial authority in federal court. This crosses a constitutional line that should concern everyone, regardless of party affiliation, Turley told Fox News. So let's break down what this could mean. First, the immediate legal implications are staggering. Federal rules of criminal procedure allow judges to hold defendants in contempt for failing to follow basic courtroom protocols. Contempt of court can result in immediate detention until the defendant agrees to comply with judicial orders. For any other defendant, refusing to stand for a federal judge would result in immediate arrest and overnight detention. Second, this creates massive problems for Trump's ongoing legal strategy. His attorneys have built their defense around portraying him as a victim of political persecution, who's being unfairly targeted by a biased justice system. But when their own client escalates a simple protocol issue into a federal standoff, it becomes almost impossible to maintain that he's the victim rather than someone who believes he's above the law. Finally, looking ahead, this fundamentally changes the dynamic of all Trump's pending criminal cases. Every judge in every jurisdiction will now know that Trump is willing to defy basic judicial authority when he doesn't like what's happening. That knowledge affects everything from bail conditions to sentencing considerations to courtroom security protocols. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious to see your perspective. But beyond the immediate legal fallout, this is really about fundamental constitutional principles. The requirement that defendants stand for federal judges isn't just about respect or tradition. It represents the principle that in America, judicial authority derives from the Constitution and the law, not from the personal preferences or political status of whoever happens to be in the courtroom. If former presidents can decide which aspects of judicial authority they'll recognize, civilian control of our legal system effectively ends. This scenario is causing absolute panic within Republican leadership circles. Reports indicate that senior GOP officials held emergency conference calls Tuesday night to determine their response. Some argued for defending Trump's actions as justified civil disobedience against a corrupt system. Others insisted that openly defying federal judges creates an indefensible political liability heading into the 2024 election season. The party is fracturing in real time between those who believe Trump can do no wrong and those who recognize that defending courtroom Defiance could destroy their credibility with independent voters. Meanwhile, Trump's core supporters are absolutely furious at Judge Cannon for what they see as deliberate humiliation of their leader. Social media exploded Tuesday night with calls to impeach federal judges and demands that Congress investigate judicial bias. To his base, this is the ultimate proof that the entire legal system is rigged against Trump and that judges are willing to abuse their authority to embarrass him. Things escalated further when Trump responded Tuesday night with a series of Truth Social posts. He called Judge Cannon a nasty, biased judge who shouldn't be allowed anywhere near this case and claimed that standing for judges is an unconstitutional requirement that violates my First Amendment rights. He specifically attacked federal marshals, calling them Biden's personal enforcement army, suggesting they were following illegal orders from the White House. Stay with me. What comes next will completely change how you view the situation. Here's what makes it even more extraordinary. Trump's response essentially confirmed every allegation about his disrespect for judicial authority. Instead of acknowledging that standing for judges is basic courtroom protocol, followed by everyone from traffic defendants to CEOs, his reaction was to attack the entire federal court system. When your defense is attacking the legitimacy of federal judges, rather than explaining why you couldn't follow basic courtroom rules, you've already lost any argument about respecting the law. Legal experts immediately flagged the constitutional problem. Alan Dershowitz, who defended Trump during his first impeachment, told CNN that the Truth Social posts make Trump's legal situation exponentially worse. You cannot attack federal judges while you're facing federal charges and expect those attacks to help your case, Dershowitz explained. This is exactly the kind of behavior that convinces judges a defendant needs additional restrictions. This goes far beyond one courtroom confrontation or one moment of defiance. It's about whether America still has a legal system where everyone follows the same rules, regardless of their political power or personal wealth. If there are no consequences for a former president openly defying federal judicial authority, it signals that our legal system has different rules for different disenfranchised people based on their political status. It's not just about Trump or this specific case. It's about whether the principle of equal justice under law has any meaning when powerful people decide they don't like what's happening in court. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. Here's the situation. A former president just openly defied basic federal court protocol while facing national security charges, forcing armed federal marshals to intervene in what became a 6-minute standoff that shattered every precedent for presidential behavior in federal court. This is no longer just another legal hearing or typical courtroom drama. It's about whether we accept that some people are simply above the laws that govern everyone else. When a defendant chooses confrontation over compliance with basic judicial authority, we've entered genuinely unprecedented constitutional territory. If there are no consequences, it sets a dangerous precedent. Future defendants will point to Trump's behavior and argue that they too should be allowed to decide which aspects of judicial authority they'll recognize. Keep a close eye on this story. Judge Cannon is expected to rule within 72 hours on whether to hold Trump in contempt of court. Federal prosecutors are reportedly reviewing whether Tuesday's behavior violates the conditions of Trump's pre-trial release, and legal scholars across the political spectrum are watching closely to see whether federal judges have the authority to enforce basic courtroom rules when the defendant is a former president. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this. Here's where things stand right now. Donald Trump just became the first former president in American history to openly defy basic judicial protocol in federal court, forcing armed federal law enforcement to intervene while he faces national security charges. Millions of Americans are watching closely to see whether federal judges have the authority to maintain order in their own courtrooms when the defendant believes he's above the law. Meanwhile, Judge Cannon faces a decision that could determine whether the presidency grants someone permanent immunity from following the same rules that apply to everyone else. This isn't just another news cycle that will fade away. This is a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. What happens next could determine whether the principle of equal Justice under law has any meaning when former presidents decide they don't like what's happening in federal court? The evidence is out there. The confrontation happened in front of dozens of witnesses. Now we wait to see if federal judges still have the authority to maintain basic order and respect in their own courtrooms, regardless of who is sitting at the defendant's table. The stakes have never been higher. The constitutional implications have never been more clear. And the moment of truth for our legal system has never been more immediate. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding value in this coverage. What we witnessed Tuesday afternoon wasn't just courtroom defiance. It was the moment when America discovered whether we still have a legal system where former presidents follow the same rules as everyone else, or whether political power grants permanent immunity from the basic requirements of justice under law.